I've come to Pegasus Bridge, site of the most audacious mission to take place on D-Day.
Well, there were several Germans on each bridge at night. This was a routine job for the German troops, so they weren't particularly motivated. And so there were 2 Germans on this bridge, a couple on the other bridge that night. Most of the Germans would go off in the evenings and sleep in the bunker next to the bridge. And in June, the weather wasn't too good on the night of the 5th, 6th of June. So there were just 2 Germans on this bridge when the British arrived. There were machine gun positions around the bridges also, but they weren't manned immediately when the British landed.
The men had trained for months. They were at the peak of their physical fitness, and they were excited. The adrenaline was pumping through their veins, but they were also nervous, frightened. There was every chance they'd be dead by the morning. Their mission depended upon stealth and silence. They were to land in gliders close to the 2 bridges, then storm them with overwhelming force. If they were successful, they'd then have to hold them for at least 12 hours until reinforced by soldiers marching inland from the beaches. There were major hurdles to be overcome. First and foremost was the difficulty of landing a glider on target, especially at night.
The Horsa glider could carry 28 men maximum. As you can see, the space for maybe 50 men. But the space wasn't the problem, it was the weight. And 28 was the absolute maximum with their equipment. Some of them were carrying 90 pounds, which is about 45 kilos. So 28 men, or a jeep and a trailer. In the trailer there could be ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment, food, or a jeep and a gun called a 6-pounder. They couldn't drive them in, the turn was too sharp, and the men had to bounce them around the corner to get them in. And they had to bounce the guns, slide the guns in, which weighed 2 tons, to get them in. So the front of the jeep was facing towards the back of the plane. If there was a gun, the muzzle was in the cockpit. The pilots had to climb over the barrel to sit down. And they told me, the pilots, they didn't mind 20-odd men behind them. They didn't like 3 tons of steel, because if it broke loose, and sadly it did on occasions, they knew which way it was going. So the jeeps would come out the back of the plane. Now, looking down the fuselage, you can see there are 2 seats at the back, an open door. Well, around the structure, around the bulkhead at that point, there were bolts in sockets with split pins. And once the plane had landed, the men would pull the pins, slide the bolts, and the tail would drop away so they could unload from the back. But can you imagine one of these landing at about 60, 70 miles per hour in a rough field? Occasionally, the fuselage could twist slightly. And if it twisted where the sockets were, of course, they were no longer aligned, and the troops couldn't get the bolts off. So to be absolutely sure they'd come off, technicians from the Air Force placed explosive charges on the bolts. So the men were in these things, blowing the charges, if they could, before the glider had stopped.
There was also the Rommel's asparagus to consider, those sharpened poles that were in virtually every field in Normandy. If a glider hit them, its wings would be ripped off. This bridge operation was not for the faint-hearted. It was dangerous and possibly fatal. "OK, chaps," said John Howard as his men boarded the gliders. "Speed is essential. We've got to take these bridges and we've got to hold them. See you there, lads. Don't be late." Some of the men had gallows humour. "If they lined the glider with silk," said one, "the thing would be ideal to bury the lot of us in." The gliders used Halifax tow planes to get them airborne. Then, once they'd crossed the English Channel, there was a loud twang as the glider detached itself from the Halifax. They were now alone, gliding towards Earth. No engines, only the wind and the skill of the pilots.
They took off from England on the evening of the 5th of June. It took 69 minutes to fly over the Channel. So at 9 minutes past midnight, the glider pilots released the tow cables from the tug aircraft well off the coast, which enabled the tug aircraft to turn and fly away, so the Germans hadn't heard the engine noise. Now, the gliders landing next to the Orne Bridge landed north of the bridge, and they dived straight in and landed in the field, one of them coming in at almost 200 miles per hour. It was released far too high, and the pilot had to dive in to avoid overshooting the bridge. And he told me he hit the ground at about 200 miles per hour, which is about the landing speed of an airliner. The gliders landing next to this bridge had to go much further, and they landed south of the bridge. So they went further south, turned, and flew in from the south using their stopwatch and compass. And the gliders landed, the 3 of them landed within 80 yards of the bridge, 80 metres. But number 1, 47 metres, 47 yards from the bridge. And the commander of the Air Force for D-Day, Lee Mallory, said it was one of the most outstanding feats of precision flying of the entire Second World War. And within 10 minutes, both bridges were captured intact.
Come out and fight, you square-headed bastards, shouted Wally Parr as he and Charlie Gardner chucked explosives into the German dugouts that surrounded the bridge. Over the minutes that followed, the Germans, now wide awake, came out fighting. Grenades, machine guns, Sten guns. The bridge was buzzing with gunfire. One of John Howard's men, Den Brotheridge, took a bullet through the neck and collapsed to the ground. He would be the first fatality on D-Day. Others were wounded by flying shrapnel, but it soon became clear that John Howard's men had the upper hand. And what of the Germans? Private Helmut Römer was an 18-year-old conscript on sentry duty that night. He'd heard the crash landing of the gliders, but didn't bother to investigate. Only when the gunfire started did he realize he was in trouble. Private Römer had no intention of fighting. He and two others leapt off the bridge and hid in an elderberry bush. Wally Parr was sniffing at victory. The battle had begun to turn. He ran across the bridge towards the nearby Café Gondry and peered through the iron grating. He could see Madame Gondry and her two terrified daughters crouching in the cellar. Parr pushed a chocolate bar through the grate. The first two children to be liberated in the invasion of Europe, he would later say, liberated by a cockney with a bar of chocolate. Benneville, or Pegasus Bridge, was now captured. And a similar success story had unfolded at Ronville Bridge, which had also been captured from the Germans. Now, the wireless operator, Colonel Tappenden, sent the agreed signal to England. Ham and jam, ham and jam. It meant the operation had been a success. The German counterattack came within the hour. John Howard's men heard the clanking of tanks as the Germans brought up their heavy armor. But they were waiting with a Piat anti-tank gun in hand. To fire this gun, you had to pull this thing back here. There's a coiled spring inside. And then you placed this inside here. You took an aim at what you wanted to knock out, and you fire. And if you got it right, you're going to knock out a jeep, a small vehicle, even a small tank. This proved crucial on the morning of the 6th of June, because the guys who'd taken and were holding Pegasus Bridge, they managed to knock out a German self-propelled gun that was coming towards the bridge. There was a massive explosion, and when the other Germans saw that, they turned and fled. So this gun here helped save the operation at Pegasus Bridge. The first shot knocked out the leading armoured vehicle, and it exploded in a ball of fire. The other tanks promptly turned and fled. The best news came in the early hours, when the men heard the loud drone of hundreds of airplanes. Then, like a miracle before their eyes, the sky was filled with parachutes. It was the first of the 7,000 troops of the 6th Airborne Division due to land over the coming hours. John Howard could hardly believe what he was seeing. One of the most awe-inspiring sights of my life, he said. But he also knew that he and his men faced the struggle of their lives over the coming hours. It was essential for them to hold the two bridges until they were relieved by the commandos, due to land on Sword Beach that very morning. They faced a tense and troubling time as they waited, hoped, and prayed. The night had never seemed so long, but the day ahead was to prove even longer. In episode 2, we'll follow the remarkable stories of the men and women who took part in the largest seaborne invasion in history.